You can learn so much by taking a piece of music and adapting it to fit other meters. This is Mozart's Rondo alla Turca, which I recomposed as a waltz. And this is me playing 4 different Afro-Cuban rhythms at the same time and warping them to be in 7/4. And in that same spirit, what if I asked you to sing the song My Favorite Things, but make it in 5? All of these examples involve adapting musical ideas from one meter to another. I would argue that this is not only a practical skill for composers and improvisers, but it also sheds light on the original piece of music, because you will have to grapple with what the distinctive features of it are. It's a form of musical analysis which is active, creative, practical, and fun. I'm going to start by adapting a couple melodies with lyrics, and I have singer-songwriter-guitarist Christopher White, also known as Isto, to sing and play through those examples. Then we'll move to some complex instrumental textures. But first, let's cover some basics. To adapt music to fit another meter, you'll either have to add beats or take them away. When you have extra time, that means some notes will need to get longer or notes get added. When you have less time, you need some notes to get shorter or cut out. To adapt music to a new meter and preserve the original character in some way, you'll need to figure out what is distinctive about the original music. That's why this is an analytical act, but in practical terms, you'll be juggling the following guidelines. Preserve material associated with downbeats and strong beats. And in this case, associated doesn't necessarily mean on the downbeat. It might also include pickup notes. Preserve the rhythmic texture. That means try not to go beyond the fastest subdivisions found in the original, and also consider to what extent the rhythm is or isn't aligned with the beats of the meter. You'll also want to preserve melodic shapes, the relationship of melody to harmony, and lyrics, or at least the lyrical content, if there is any. You rarely can keep all of these, so it'll become a balancing act to decide which features are more important than others. We'll start with the very malleable opening phrase of the House of the Rising Sun. There are many versions out there, but to make this more manageable, let's just assume that this version you're about to hear and see is the original form we're going to adapt. Here's Isto.
There is a house in New Orleans they call the Rising Sun.
Notice that all the notes of the melody are little units associated with downbeats of each measure. We can preserve pretty much everything on my list of guidelines by simply adjusting the space between those little motives, as long as they continue to be associated with downbeats. So let's just cut a beat out and put this in 5/8 and keep all of those motives still landing on downbeats.
There is a house in New Orleans they call the Rising Sun.
This was an unusually straightforward example, so let's start to take on gradually more challenging tasks. These are the opening measures of My Favorite Things.
Raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens, bright copper kettles and warm woolen mittens, brown paper packages tied up with string. These are a few of my favorite things.
Notice that the rhythmic texture is very consistent as quarter notes, and lyrically there's one note per syllable. Every 4 measure, there's also a little bit room left for a breath. So let's start by seeing what happens if we adapt this into 4/4. That means 1 more beat per measure, so one note will need to get longer. But making notes longer can also add emphasis to them. If I just mechanically lengthen the 3rd note of each measure, this could get awkward by overemphasizing an unaccented syllable like this.
Raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens, bright copper kettles and warm woolen mittens, brown
I have another video about lyrics and types of musical accent, which I can link in the description. But the point is that this will work better if you lengthen notes consciously thinking about accented syllables and places that make linguistic sense to have pauses. I did that in this version, while also trying to compose in some variety so that it doesn't feel too boxed in.
Raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens, bright copper kettles and warm woolen mittens, brown paper packages tied up with string. These are a few of my favorite things.
This version definitely feels more comfortable, but notice that we've lost the idea of a steady rhythmic texture in quarter notes from the original. You could maintain the idea of having quarter notes by adding in some melismas, but then you'd lose the idea of setting one note per syllable. I think the best procedure is probably to try to find some balance between all of these. So I'm mostly going to lengthen the first note, but not always. And sometimes I'll have a steady stream of quarter notes by adding in melismas, but not every measure.
Raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens, bright copper kettles and warm woolen mittens, brown paper packages tied up with...
There's not a single right answer for how to recompose my favorite things in 4/4. But just remember that among my guidelines, you don't need to rigidly cling to one at the complete expense of another. Let's keep this same piece, but engage other aspects of it by shifting to a meter that requires taking away beats. Let's go first to 2/4, which would be pretty drastic. And if you want to preserve the original lyrics, you're going to have to change the rhythmic texture pretty substantially by using eighth notes.
Raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens, bright copper kettles and warm woolen mittens, brown paper packages tied up with string. These are a few of my favorite things.
That might be too drastic of a change, but now would be a good opportunity for me to point out that meter is not the same thing as a time signature. This song has the time signature of 3/4. But those measures themselves are also grouped into phrases of 4. Since every 2 measures is 6 beats, I could adapt this by cutting 1 beat every other measure, and then we'd end up with a feeling in 5. One thing I didn't like so much about the version in 2/4 from before was that it violated my guideline about rhythmic texture because it introduced faster note values than existed in the original, of eighth notes. So let's see if we can make this 5/4 version without using any eighth notes. We're going to need to cut a few notes out to do this, and that means changing the lyrics a little bit. In the first phrase, maybe jettison some repeated notes and maintain the melodic contour, and try to keep the distinctive words like raindrops and whiskers, and cut out the expendable words like and on. The melody of packages tied could preserve strong beats by cutting the weak beat and going to present tied. Picking a note to cut in the last phrase is not so easy though. There aren't repeated notes to cut here. So let's go through the characteristics of the phrase and decide what is important to keep and what we can live without. The phrase is all stepwise motion except a leap at the end. The beginning of each measure has a third in relation to the harmony. The high point is the note B, and the penultimate measure has an upper neighbor shape. Here are some ways you could cut a note that maintain some of the characteristics. If you let go of stepwise motion, you could have a skip and land on the chord tone of A. You could let go of the landing on the third like this, or maintain the idea of a scale to B like this. Or you could let go of the high point B and try to use the shape of packages, which went from a ninth up to a third and then back down to the root, and we had lost that earlier, so then inserting it back might make a little bit of sense. Let's hear just one possible version in 5. In this case, I decided to cut a syllable of the lyrics so that there's still rhythmic texture of one syllable per beat, but a melisma allows me to keep the full melodic contour.
Raindrops on roses, whiskers on kittens, bright copper kettles, warm woolen mittens, brown paper presents tied up with string. These are just 5 of my favorite things.
Let's switch over to some musical textures without lyrics, and that'll give us more freedom to add or cut notes without worrying about the effect it'll have on linguistic accent and content. This is Mozart's Rondo alla Turca, which was written as a fast march. Notice that it is in 2/4, so there are 2 beats, but the accompaniment pattern in eighth notes means that there are 4 accompaniment notes or chords per measure. The bass notes are usually on downbeats, but occasionally it's also on each beat. If I were to convert this to just any generic 3/4, that would simply add a beat. But I have an idea that should be more interesting. What if we convert this to a waltz? That means we're still going to the time signature of 3/4, but a specific type of 3/4, where the accompaniment should only have 1 chord per beat. This is a more interesting meter change because the melody goes from having 2 beats to 3, but the accompaniment goes down from having 4 notes to 3 per measure. If you think about this as having 2 motives, each which is associated with a downbeat, we can just expand the space in between them to adapt that to 3/4. And if we define those flourishes later on as material that fills the measure, we can preserve that idea of a measure full of melodic activity by adding in one more of those little double neighbor figures. For the left hand, I'm going to keep the idea of bass notes on downbeats and chords in between, but notice that we can't subdivide measures in half like the original did occasionally. See what you come up with if you try to do the rest of this piece converted into a waltz, and you can compare what you came up with to my solution, which I'll link in the description. Let's do another metric conversion, but this time go beyond a solo piano texture and make our starting point 4 classic Afro-Cuban rhythmic layers: piano montuno, bass tumbao, clave, and cascara. I'm going to have the piano montuno oscillate between A minor and G major, and that's strategic because later on I want to be able to play a bass line with 1 foot. Taking a chord progression and turning it into an Afro-Cuban montuno should be as essential of a music theory skill as realizing a Baroque figured bass in 4 parts, which is to say that they are both excellent exercises based upon some very narrow and genre-specific stylistic norms. Anyway, let's run down the features of this particular montuno in order to better adapt it into other meters. The rhythm overall is a 2-measure pattern, which is only on the beat at the very beginning of each pair of measures. Notice that it starts with an arpeggiation, and there are 2 main voicings, octaves or inner voice chords. Notice also that there's only 1 time that octaves repeat on the same note, and that is at the beginning of the cycle and its anticipation. There are never 2 inner voice chords in a row. And for this one, there's a chromatic line which links into the new harmony. I'm not going to go into the details of every single other rhythmic pattern, but the clave is a 2-measure pattern. In this case, it's called a 2-3 son clave. Notice that 1 measure starts with a rest and has 2 notes on the beats, whereas the other half has a note on the downbeat and some syncopation. Now let's hear how these parts interact with each other, and I'll introduce them one at a time. When you put all 4 of these parts together, there's a really cool feature. Out of every available eighth note in the meter, there's only one spot where all parts begin a note at the same time. That happens at the one note in the clave which isn't on a beat. And there's also only one spot when no part begins a note, and that spot directly follows the one where everyone plays. I'm going to adapt all 4 of these parts to other meters, and I want to maintain that composite feature as well while I'm recomposing. Now let's adapt this in a way that cuts one beat from each 2-measure unit so that it'll become in 7/4. Notice that simply cutting a beat is going to make me have multiple octave voicings in a row, not at the downbeat, or there will be multiple inner voice voicings in a row, and that will depart from the texture I had in the original. I think a more idiomatic option would be to extend the chromatic line. In the first half, it now extends down to C sharp. In the second half, it now goes all the way up to F. A meter change into 7/8 would force me to grapple with another sort of asymmetry. If I use my rule of thumb to preserve ideas associated with downbeats, including the pickup, some notes will have to get a little squashed together. Now let's take this in the other metric direction. We can go up by adding a beat per 2-measure phrase and arrive at a feeling of 5. Now we need some extra music, so I'm going to make that work by extending the chromatic line much like I did in the 7/4 example. Adjusting the clave into 5/4, I'm now going to make its ending similar in shape to the original. I love this clave because there's a variation of a regular clave in 4/4 called a rumba clave, and we now have an amalgam of both the rumba and the son claves. I didn't go into every single detail of how I adapted these examples into other meters, but every time I went through the process, I noticed aspects of each piece and each layer that I would not have otherwise noticed. It is a manageable compositional task that forced me to grapple with the relationship of melody to harmony, melodic shapes, rhythmic textures, lyrical content, and text setting. Don't just watch me do this. Grab some music you already know really well and see what you learn by trying to fit it into another meter.